Welcome to the Media Roundtable Industry Edition, where we're diving deep into events and topics around the business of audio through the lens of brands and buyers who support it. We go a little further behind the scenes to talk to the business of audio, the secrets of the craft, which allow brands and creators to impact audiences and culture through the work that they put into the world. I'm your host, Jennifer Lane with Oxford Road. And today I have some very exciting news. We're debuting a new segment. As many of you already know, Podnews, the industry's leading newsletter for podcasting, has proudly announced the acquisition of Podcast Business Journal, a well-respected newsletter from Streaming Publishing Incorporated. There are two reasons we're excited about this. The first is because we've always greatly admired and respected James Cridland, the business he's built, and we've benefited from and appreciated the insight and perspective he's provided the industry over the years. Collaborating with him on a segment at the start of each of our episodes feels like a natural evolution of that, and we know it will provide a great benefit to our audience. Second, as you will see later in the episode, Oxford Road has spent the last few years expanding our business internationally. Podcast advertising has experienced explosive growth across Europe, down in Australia, and throughout other countries peppered around the world. And based on this, as well as expanding client needs, we've broadened our business into markets well beyond the US. We're going to dive deeper into this with a special feature episode later today. But given its international focus, it made perfect sense to launch a recurring segment with James Cridland today. So without further delay, I'm happy to introduce James Cridland, editor of Podnews and Podcast Business Journal, Dan Granger, founder and CEO of Oxford Road, and Neal Lucey, EVP of Strategy and Product at Oxford Road. Welcome to Industry News with Podcast Business Journal. James, Dan, and Neal, welcome to our very first segment of Industry News with Podcast Business Journal. James, we're so excited about this big news. Do you want to share how this came together and what it means for both publications moving forward?
Yeah, I'm really excited. So Podcast Business Journal has been going since 2018. And it's a great thing to be able to really focus on the business of podcasting. So I ended up acquiring that company a couple of months ago. And so what I'm doing with the Podcast Business Journal is really making that a real focus for the business of podcasting, for a long-form interview every single week, and just the information that you need if you're interested in the corporate world of podcasting. So hugely excited about the future, and great to have the Podcast Business Journal alongside the Podnews newsletter, which I write every day.
Well, then that leads very organically into the format for these episodes, which is industry news from the previous week. The first article that we wanted to highlight came from Podcast Business Journal, as all of these have, and it addresses YouTube's RSS ingest of details for podcasting. Do you want to give us a little bit of an overview on what that article said?
Yeah, so this is basically YouTube is trialing with a couple of big podcast partners, trialing RSS, and everybody went, yay, this is fantastic, because RSS and YouTube, and that'll mean podcasting can get into YouTube, except it's not quite as yay, I don't think, as it might be, in that they're using RSS as ingest only. You're not allowed any advertising in your podcasts that go onto YouTube as well. So it really is just, I think somebody else this week called it a shovel. It's just a shovel for YouTube to shove more podcasts into their platform. Not necessarily sure whether it's good news for podcasting as a whole.
We don't know, at least based on what's in the article, where they're going with this, right? But we do know that Google likes to have a lot of market share, and they probably got the memo that a lot of people were consuming podcasts on their platform. They obviously don't want to go the way of Apple, where you have all of these people harvesting off your land and not charging them for it. So I can understand that. It does feel a little bit like Span to me, the Spotify Audience Network. And if I'm reading the tea leaves, I can imagine a scenario where they're going to be piping in their inventory And if they can make this something that is just a feature where they can distribute more of their ads that they run on YouTube programmatically, then all of a sudden they get to kind of kick out everybody else, offer this, third leg of the stool, knowing what a significant share of distribution they have, and split the revenue directly with the creator or the publisher. That would make a lot of sense to me. Now, back to James's point, is that good for the industry? I'm not sure that it is, because, one of the things we keep making noise about is how commoditized everything's getting. And are we really just going to reduce ourselves to, a place that you can serve a bunch of banner ads or display ads effectively, where you're pumping in really safe creative that's very detached from a show? And yeah, maybe you can audience target with it, but it's one more line of separation between the host and the advertiser that's in the program, which is the foundation of podcast. It is the thing that made it special and precious. And so I am concerned at what it represents in the future. I think there's a window very briefly where a lot of creators are realizing that, hey, I can simulcast my show here. It's great for my advertisers. There's more impressions to sell. And just as soon as we're all adapting to that and learning that dance, we're getting kicked out again. And going to have to go through another door that's not as attractive as the one we had to begin with. So I'm not crazy about it for brands, but certainly makes sense for YouTube.
Oh, yeah. Makes perfect sense for YouTube. And as this document says, your hosting company cannot see how many times a podcast episode was listened to on YouTube, because all podcast content on YouTube is hosted on YouTube. So they're cutting out podcast hosting companies. They're cutting out podcast advertisers. They're cutting out basically all of the bits of podcasting, apart from the creators who are now dealing directly with YouTube. So if that's the future that we all want, then cool. But I'm not necessarily sure that that's a great thing.
Yeah, I'm curious about the revenue share. And I think, as Dan mentioned, it's a trial right now, but clearly I think YouTube wants
they have a model, right? And their model is not to create ancillary models, right? It's to plug them in.
Yeah.
They want to get paid.
Stack them high, sell them cheap, and frankly depersonalized, which is, that's the issue.
Yeah, and I think the other thing for me is from an agency perspective, we oftentimes see simulcast podcasts perform better. So we want to drive the best performance for our advertisers, and we don't want to take away a component that potentially drives more business for our clients.
Well, you're transitioning us to skip ahead to our ACAST story with that kind of talk.
Well, before we get there, I guess would it be fair to say, let's call a spade, and the only thing that makes this content seem like podcast content is the RSS feed?
Oh, well, now, if we're going to go down a conversation around what is a podcast,
too existential.
That we're here for the next half hour. But I would suggest that to most people, podcasts are things on YouTube. But the big difference here is that, particularly from YouTube's point of view, there's no need for a podcast hosting company anymore. And those are the people who, frankly, have been educating and encouraging podcasters to get up and running. There's no need for many large advertising agencies anymore, because Google is going to be doing all of that anyway. And so, frankly, and by the way, attribution, that's going to be very hard as well. So, nothing to do with RSS, nothing to do with the podcast technical landscape as we currently see it. So from my point of view, I'm not sure that this is a future that we really want as an industry, I'll be honest.
Here.
And speaking of futures we may not want as in the industry, talk to us about the announcement from the stage about Spotify and AI voice creation.
Yeah, so this isn't necessarily an official announcement from Spotify, but it's something that Bill Simmons, who of course is founder of The Ringer, hinted at in a recent podcast, basically saying that they are cloning the voices of podcast hosts to allow them to do host-read advertising without the inconvenient thing of actually asking the hosts directly to do that. which to me doesn't necessarily sound like a good plan. I'm sure that Dan has a view on this as well.
Dan, he hates live reads.
I'm meek and mild.
I had a question, like, do you think Bill Simmons just went rogue, or was this by design that he leaked this information?
Well, there's an interesting question. I think the only person who would necessarily know that is Bill himself. I would say that Spotify are just giving their usual statement of, we're always working to enhance the Spotify experience. So potentially Spotify don't necessarily want to say anything about it at the moment. I mean, to me, the whole point about a host read ad is that the talent has at least tried the product or knows something about the product and can inject something a little bit personal about it. And is an AI voice going to do that job? I don't know.
Dan?
Yeah, it's the same theme, and I think it's a theme that our industry has to really struggle with in the stage that we're in, because even before this AI revolution that's starting to kick in this year, like we were saying earlier, everything's getting commoditized. And so when you do that with trust, that's a big problem. And so, I made some statements when this article came out that seemed to resonate with a lot of folks, just saying, like, look, when you're introducing something that is overtly artificial into the dynamic of a host who builds a relationship with their audience, and then makes a recommendation that they should trust something that they didn't technically even say, how much value does that take away from that recommendation? I mean, it's like, look, if I send my wife a birthday card that's written by a machine, but it has my name on it, is that really going to be touching to her? Or is she going to say, yeah, but what do you think? These are people, these are human beings, and we're trying to make recommendations to them and tell them things that we mean and we believe. And as soon as you start extracting the part that is inefficient, the part that doesn't scale, the trust, the vetting, the reputational alignment, you take that out and you just turn every message into Play-Doh, then nothing has any value. And so I would say that this is maybe one of the more potentially harmful versions that we're seeing. I'm hopeful that it's sort of like autonomous driving and dies on the 1 yard line before we really get there. But that may not happen. And if it does, I think what the industry is going to find out is like, look, yeah, we sure figured out how to efficiently distribute ads. And we were able to make robots that sure sound like people making recommendations. But once you realize it's a robot, you're done. And then we're going to have to start putting disclaimers at the ad that say, this is not AI. I really mean this. Now how good is the AI once that happens? Like, because if I'm paying for the endorsement, I'm not going to play this game.
I actually think that this isn't going to die on the 1 yard line. I think that AI isn't currently where it needs to be in order to add that nuanced personality and sort of emotional dictation and interpretation into a podcast episode. That being said, there are companies like Bark AI and 11 Labs doing super interesting stuff in this space. And maybe it'll be sort of another Spotify acquisition tour of outside companies. But I think it has, I hate to say it because nothing bothers me more than currently listening to an AI giving sort of voice direction. However, I do think that it will increase very exponentially, and the quality will just continue getting better and better. And there are different ways to sort of, sadly trick people into believing you're speaking instead of your voice is being used to say something that it believes you would likely say.
Well, I guess my point is, as soon as, somebody runs a commercial that says something that the host does not believe and feels, gets starting to get challenged on something that they said that they didn't actually say. Think of all the litigation that's going to happen.
Yeah, look, it's a licensing and contract nightmare. But if you're signing the rights away to your voice because Spotify bought them and you agreed to it, I wonder what your rights really are at that point.
I think I'm looking forward to Joe Rogan telling me saying, hey, it would be you should think about better security for your house. It would be a real shame if something happened to that house on 27 Avenue Road, wouldn't it?
Exactly.
And I think that the interesting thing here, of course, is that Spotify is sign-in only. So Spotify knows my name, Spotify knows my address, Spotify knows, lots of things about me, who I bank with, and I've done some work with, looking at the data that Spotify hoovers up about me. They know what kind of car I drive because of the Bluetooth connection into the car, all of this kind of information. So actually, Spotify could do a really interesting personalized job of then telling Joe Rogan to menace me with all of the information that they actually know. Hey, you want to be careful of that Toyota Prius. It's just a really interesting move. But to me, it's as Dan, you said in an interview for the Podcast Business Journal a few months ago, you said, how fast can the industry get away from even associating hosts with the advertising? And I think that this is one of those ways.
Exactly.
Yeah. I would add, I don't want this for endorsement advertising. One potential benefit of this, however, is the ability to take that content and extend it into different geographies, different languages, as long as it's disclosed in the host's voice. So if it's Joe Rogan, like where you can consume the Joe Rogan podcast in Spanish where you couldn't previously, maybe there's something there as a way to extend the reach of podcasts, to get podcasts in front of more people. So there could be some positive aspect to it, but I don't want an AI endorsed red ad.
Yeah, I think that's a really good framing of it. There's a useful application for all of this. But when you start dealing in matters of trust and personal relationship, that's where I just think dilution of value will backfire, and the efficiency produces an opposite effect, because it just betrays the trust of the audience. But yeah, if they're going to do something that's a little bit more custom for me because, I like green instead of blue, then okay, that could have a value. But yeah, I think that people are going to express that they have less trust in the ads if they don't feel that they're authentic, bottom line.
James, do you want to give us an overview on what's developing overseas?
Australia, but I was in the UK last week at the Podcast Show 2023, which is a massive, massive show. Really exciting to end up being there. And one of the announcements made there was that Edison Podcast Metrics is being launched in the UK, and they're currently out in field for the research at the moment. They even published a top 5 of the most listened to podcasts in the country, which they gave us in no order, and that list includes the Joe Rogan Experience, as you might guess, but also the others were just British shows. So the Diary of a CEO, Off Menu with Ed Gamble and James Acaster, a podcast with a naughty word in it, but it's got something to do with being married and annoyed, and another word, and the rest is politics as well. I'm really exciting, actually, because this is the first ranker that the UK will have had, and podcast consumption in the UK is really, really strong. So I'm very excited to actually see some of these numbers coming out.
Yeah, James, is it possible that the story here is the fact that it takes so long to do something so simple? Like, okay, we're surveying people. There's a survey that went out in the UK about what podcasts do you listen to? And it's not a knock on Edison. I'm glad somebody's doing it, right? And Edison, seems very credible to do so. So happy that they're doing it. But what's with our industry being reluctant to push out surveys? We literally can have an AI voice pretending to be James Cridland, giving out any list that you want. But to actually ask 2,000 opt-in strangers to say, tell us what shows you like that's a revelation. Why does it take so long for us to develop some of these rudimentary tools that are necessary for the evolution of the field when we're so busy with all these technical solutions that are really hard to deliver.
Yeah, and I think there has been conversations over the last 3, 4, 5 years talking about a UK podcast ranker, and there are many podcast rankers that exist across the rest of the world as well. I guess that the difference here is that nobody could really agree. And those rankers like Podtrack, like the Triton rankers and everything else, they are participating people only. So they're not listing everybody. And that's the difference between this survey, is that it is talking to people every single week. It is finding out what shows they're listening to, and it's every single show which is out there. I think for me, the interesting thing was we have all grown up in the UK to think that the BBC is the number one in terms of podcasting and blah, blah, blah. They're not in the top 5 at all, which seems to show that the BBC isn't probably as big as they think they are. And I think that'll be really interesting seeing what happens when we get more of a view into the ranker when it comes out later on in the year. But as to your point about why it's taking so long, yeah, completely agree.
Yeah, James, I was going to say that I'm glad it's here. I wonder why it took to the midway point of 2023 to have an independent podcast ranker for the UK. But I guess it's been I look back and I think they do an infinite dial for the UK. So they do research on the UK market and certainly a lot of podcast insights in there. I think the last one was 2021. So I suspect it's going to be updated this year. So they don't do the infinite dial necessarily every year outside the US in certain markets, but I suspect that's coming. But I think it's great that this is here. It's just curious that it took so long.
Yeah, no, I mean, to your point earlier, James, about only one of the shows being American-based content, that's what I thought was one of the more exciting things. And we're later on in the episode, we're talking about what we're doing internationally. It's a special feature this week. But to me, that was the most surprising. Of the 5 top shows, I was surprised to only see one American show, and surprised in a very good and positive way. I thought I would see more content just based on general audience size and awareness of these podcast hosts who become celebrities. And it's nice to see that it's still a very localized listening experience, which I think sort of reinforces the intimacy of the channel and the audience is to sort of demand or draw to the intimacy of the channel and wanting it to feel more relatable and custom to them.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think, interesting to see the amount of homegrown content in all of the podcast rankers. When you look into places like Denmark or Sweden, those podcast rankers, everybody speaks English perfectly there, but those podcast rankers, again, show local content there. And the same down here in Australia, where again, we're seeing an awful lot of homegrown content here as well. So I think that it does show an awful lot to the benefit of local content, of culturally significant content, and I think that that's a great thing. Interestingly, actually, Gabriel was telling me that they were really concerned about having the Joe Rogan show in that top 5, and they were asking people, does it make sense that Joe Rogan is in that list? And they were really, really worried about it. But I think it's absolutely right. Yeah, there is an awful lot of people who tune in to that show wherever they are in the world.
I just wanted to draw out something that you said when you were describing the story, James, which is that it took a while for them to agree on which measurement system to trust. And I think, what I hear you saying without saying it is that Edison may be the only one that is not for sale, where you can't buy your network into or out of the tool or the ranking system. And so that's why they ended up leading the charge on this, because people really didn't want something that they knew that a player could kind of pay their way into or out of. Is that what you're saying?
I don't think I'm saying that, but I think what I am saying is that when you have a look into the UK market, trying to get agreement from all of the different players in that market, given that the BBC is so large and strong, given that commercial radio, again, is very, very big in that particular market, then actually getting agreement of a particular technical standards to go with is really quite hard. And you only have to look, down here in this part of the world to see that the Triton rankers that we have here don't include the ABC, the public service broadcaster. They're still working on their inclusion. Again, because of conversations around the technology and around the privacy and various other things. I don't think there's any evidence that people are buying their way in, but I would say that I've heard some concern about Triton's rankers, given that Triton is owned by iHeart. And if you're a competitor to iHeart, then giving your entire log files to iHeart seems slightly suboptimal in terms of how you might want to approach, your business. So I suppose that there is that kind of side in there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've had a lot of internal discussions about which tool we should be trusting in the US. And some of the feedback I've gotten was that Edison was sampling all shows and all networks, whereas others may have, whether it's an ownership piece or some other form of commercial arrangement, there may be certain networks that are deliberately added or not added, just depending on some of those entanglements. But maybe it's not as big a deal as I think.
So you have a look in the US, for example, and Podtrac always has iHeart as number one. iHeart, though, isn't measured by the Triton ranker, which usually has Sirius XM as number one. Spotify isn't measured by either of those two, and guess what? Spotify is number one in the Edison ranker in the US. So I think you end up with some companies that are quite keen to only be in those charts where they think that they will be number one, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why iHeart isn't in the Triton ranker. And it's particularly weird because Triton is owned by iHeart, let us not forget. So why is iHeart not in its own ranker? But then I suppose you could look at it the other side and say, well, if they were in the Triton ranker, then they would be number one, wouldn't they? So I suppose it's a no-win, thing for them.
Mm.
Acast released some really interesting ROI data on podcast, which, if all accurate and true, is a really good champion for why people should be doubling down in this space. James, you want to give us an overview?
Yeah, they did. They released a bunch of really interesting research. 2/3 of podcast advertisers say that for every dollar they spend in podcast advertising, they see somewhere between $2 and $6 back. 20% of podcast advertisers say that they see more than $6 back, which Acast claims is the most of any other tested medium. So certainly ROI seems to be doing very well in terms of advertising on podcasts, which is a nice thing.
Yeah. Did they disclose how many businesses they looked at or any of the parameters there?
There's a good question.
They disclosed that it's survey based.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Among marketers. I was hoping it was.
Did they say anything about sample size or anything like that?
I think they may have said something about sample size.
Yeah, I mean, look,
I had some hope that it was based on like market mix modeling, but that was too ambitious of me.
I mean, when I saw this story, my reaction was, first of all, like, yeah, we know that's why we work in this, like, trust is high. And that's why we're trying to protect things like, trust and authenticity, but there was a piece of it. And the fact that I learned from the article that they have a group business director of national performance. As a performance marketer, I'm like, wow, I wish every network had a head of performance that was paying attention to that. But the thing that I wasn't crazy about that made me question some of it was when there's a quote, they say, there's a myth in our industry that successful media buys happen at the show level, when in fact, it's the marketers who invest in podcast audience interests and behaviors who see the strongest returns on their investments. And I got to tell you, our experience disagrees with that. It doesn't mean that we don't want to. It doesn't mean that we don't like targeting. But again, I think we get led into this trap. The fundamental assumption with all marketing is that it's all about reaching the right people. But there are also schools of thought that are very much counter to that that say it's, there is some consideration of reaching the right people, but you'll actually go further if you don't target and you message to the right people in much more efficient ways. And that's what our experience reflects. So I do question some of the conclusions coming out of this report, although I don't question that podcasts is a really good ROI tool. I just don't know what exactly type of how credible the data we're working with it here is.
I think there's always a question, isn't there, in terms of information that comes from somebody that benefits from that information being good. Having said that, from what I read, it's a study with 250 advertisers and marketers. The study was conducted with a third-party company called Attest, who I've not heard of, but I'm sure that you folks have, in May. I would say, though, all study participants work full-time jobs, have a household income of over $50,000 and live in the US. I'm not sure necessarily that all podcast listeners work full-time jobs, have a household income of over 50,000. Well, so there is always that side as well, I suppose.
So that's good sampling, and I can attest that I've never heard of that group, but a third party is a good thing. But I think the bottom line for me is that look, it is true. We fully agree that audio and podcasts, because of the relationship with the host, do work better on an impression by impression basis than other media channels. Fully subscribe to that. But then to extrapolate from that information and say our model of audience targeting is actually better for ROI than show targeting is a leap that I don't know is supported by the data that came out in the research. It seems like that might have kind of gotten wedged in there.
Yeah. So that's from the marketer and advertiser perspective, that audience targeting performs best. Acast did point out where they see differences. And I think one of the differences that Acast sees in their own research is contextual targeting performs better. So it's survey based. You're going to say what you think works best versus what works best. And to your point, oftentimes we like to have our audience targeting. It isn't always the audience targeting that makes the campaigns work. Oftentimes it isn't.
So I think my concern is that, it's not that it's bad. The impression does work better, but the problem that happens whenever you target in marketing is that you pay a premium for every time you narrow your set. And what happens is the premium starts washing out the gains you get from targeting. So they kind of arbitrage you out. And that's usually the problem we run into.
Yeah. I'm almost yet to see where the performance hasn't been undermined by the premium paid for the targeting.
Yep.
James, do you want to share a bit of news coming out of your own home country?
Yes, the IAB here in Australia released some data showing that overall ad revenue online went down by 0.8%. Boo. But podcast ad revenue saw 20.7% annual growth, which is a good thing. And actually that coincides with the UK also saying that podcast ad revenue last year grew by 32%. And IAB data from the US saying that podcast advertising grew 26% last year. So it's very good news and bucking the trend in terms of podcast ad revenue all over the world, I think.
We just want podcast advertising to take a bigger piece of that online spend.
James, did it say how much of that is contributed to by the fact that James Cridland and Podnews is based there? Because I'm sure that's a big chunk of that 20%. I blame you.
I'm sure that's got something to do with it.
Other countries should pay you to move.
I mean, podcast advertising itself, to your point, Neal, increasing its share of total audio expenditure by 2%, but it's still quite small, really, in the whole, even audio share. So it would be nice to see the share of of ad revenue increasing. But really interesting data, and I think it's just good seeing that podcast advertising really bucking the trend in terms of the rest of of the online ad spend. So some good news from this part of the world.
I totally agree. I mean, I think the US, I think the online ad spend overall was maybe up 3%, I think, in that IAB study. So to be 26% growth, I'll take it. And it's great to be in a medium that's growing and growing that rapidly.
Well, and speaking of podcast advertising revenue, Dan Granger has been drinking a blackberry hint water this entire episode so far. But if we upload this via YouTube RSS feed, we'll use all our ad revenue because we'll have to cut his segment.
Sponsorships are okay. It's just actual ads which are not. So you never know. You might be able to get that passed.
All right. Well, thank you so much, James. This was an incredible maiden voyage of our new industry news segment with Podcast Business Journal. And we're super excited about having you back in the next week or so.
Super excited. Thank you so much. Next week, I'll be in Toronto in Canada. So looking forward to speaking to you from there.
All right. So tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies. Indeed, Shopify, NetSuite, Headspace, Quip, Theragun, Postmates. You know, I'm not only the host of the Media Roundtable, but also CEO of a company called Oxford Road, and we are the world's leading independently owned and operated audio ad agency. And what that means is that we help great companies, many that you have probably heard of on some of the other podcasts that you listen to. We help them test and scale campaigns in audio channels, with podcast being one of those leading channels. Some of the work that we do includes media planning and buying, as well as analytics, attribution, and insights. And we also have a very special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. We have our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. If you're looking to be involved in audio and you want a partner that can help work with you to make sure that you achieve unprecedented ROI and massive scale, you should get in touch with us at Oxford Road. And by the way, the only reason that we're able to do the work of the Media Roundtable is because we have a great team at Oxford Road that supports us and makes it possible. So, you know, what we're doing is not just a podcast, but we're really trying to help brands live out their values and balance that with their business objectives, which is an increasingly hard thing to do in this world of misinformation and malice that's infecting so much of our media. But at Oxford Road, we don't want to just broker this stuff. We want to impact the industry for good. We want to raise the bar on what gets created. And Oxford Road is helping make that possible through the Media Roundtable. So if you're somebody that's interested in working with an ad agency or a partner on this type of work for your advertising campaigns, go to oxfordroad.com. It's easy to spell. And get in touch with us, or at least just sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer. That's oxfordroad.com.
All right, well, let's dive into today's episode. Today, we're going a little further behind the scenes to talk about the business of audio and the secrets of the craft. This is a special episode as we're diving into the world of international podcast. Joining us, we have Stephen Abraham, president of Oxford Road, Kyle Jelinek, senior director of client strategy at Oxford Road, Giles Martin, EVP of strategy and insights at Oxford Road, and Neal Lucey, whom you know from the first segment. Stephen, Kyle, Neal, and Giles, welcome to the Media Roundtable.
Thank you for having us.
All right. So added to the international luster of this feature, Giles, you're fresh off of podcast show in London. Sort of walk us through what people were talking about in the room, what was top of mind amongst attendees, what the formula for the event was.
Well, it was a big show this year, and I have to confess I wasn't there last year. So just sort of based on people's narratives, it really seems like this London show is gathering significant momentum, particularly obviously for the global market. And it was a really busy show. The roster of speakers and sessions was absolutely packed, one after the other. Rooms right next to each other with all competing presentations, and some presentations I couldn't even get into. Like it was too full. There were a lot of exhibitors in all sorts of different parts of the industry. I think for the most part, the show continues to be a little bit more targeted towards the creator and the publisher side. but there was a space, more dedicated to sort of advertiser and brand type content. Perhaps unsurprisingly, and again, obviously this reflects somewhat my bias in terms of my experience of the show and the topics that I was interested in, but I do think that they are reflective of topics that are of interest to the industry generally. AI, unsurprisingly, is one of the foremost ones, particularly obviously with that, in terms of how it regards creation and content creation, but also adapting content, cutting down content, editing content, creating promos, creating other language versions of shows and content. Obviously, it's a huge area far beyond podcasts that, this is just one industry, struggling to get its hands around what the implications might be. I don't think that they're clear yet, but in another time, perhaps they might be. Other than that, the role of video in podcasts continues to be a really, really important one. And, we obviously talk about that a lot from the advertiser side in terms of, impressions in YouTube and other environments where we may not traditionally have been doing a good job of counting impressions. And I think that continues to be very, very important. However, it seems increasingly important for networks and for creators to have a video component of their shows, simply because it serves the promotion of their shows so well. By doing 20-second cut downs and putting them out on TikTok or putting them out on Instagram, this is an increasingly important, if not essential, way for shows to be getting the word out and driving up audiences. So video is another key topic, I think, for the industry generally. And then obviously with it being an international show, and we touched on this a bit already, I think perhaps the final thing I'd say is just how producers are increasingly looking to adapt content for international markets. And, there were quite a few presentations from different production houses or, from the BBC or from, the CBC in Canada, about how they are either commissioning content from other markets or that they've been pitched in other markets and they'll adapt it for the UK, or they will take content from the UK and run it in markets that are part of the World Service Network. So that, I think, is increasingly important and interesting to people, and it ties back in obviously to that AI conversation with, I think it's going to be increasingly easy to create that type of diversity in content moving forward. It's not a given because there are a lot of nuances that AI isn't capable of picking up yet, which I think we'll get to a bit later when we talk more about brand safety as well. But those, I think, are three of the key things that I heard last week.
And I guess speaking to that a little bit, I guess a recurring theme on our show is the industry has a lot of work to do, and we've come a long way and we continue to grow in an explosive way, but we still have a lot of the pipes to build. We still have a lot of tools to track measurement, attribution, et cetera. Neal, would you say that's a larger problem internationally, or do you feel that international sort of tools and capabilities are keeping up with how we are proceeding in the US?
I think it's an issue that the resources and the capabilities of research partners are just farther along in the US. So that gives us a step ahead. Over international markets, I think it is improving for sure. So, we look at YouGov research, we look at Global Web Index research that has information about podcast adoption and time spent across the world. So there is information out there. It's just a little bit harder to find, and it's a little less consistent overall.
And going back to your comment, Giles, and I know, Stephen, you have a perspective to add here as well, but you mentioned how AI tools are going to help us expand to international audiences and a lot of the excitement surrounding that. I mean, there are a million different areas we can dive into in regards to hesitation on diversity or international acclamation, et cetera. Like, is there a bit of caution in the air when these topics are coming into play, or is everyone just pretty excited because it opens up new areas without investing significant amounts of money in order to grow audience in a different language.
I mean, from what I heard, I think the excitement outweighs the caution pretty significantly right now. I think that there's, people see an enormous amount of opportunity. I think we all know that a lot of these algorithms, have issues within them, in terms of the training data, in terms of the bias that may be introduced. And I think that, some of the more, switched on networks and creators are probably a bit more in tune with that. But I think for the most part, if you're looking at applications like, translation or summarization, I think it's relatively safe territory for podcasters for the most part. And so, I think that's why they're skewing more towards excitement.
Yeah, I have a question about AI because I think, and Giles, I wonder if you have a perspective on this from attending the conference. So I think one of the issues with podcast adoption around the world, especially in non-English speaking and Spanish speaking countries, is there's just not a ton of content. So I heard you talk about content and the BBC kind of expanding their usage of content and hopefully, putting that out into more places. Was there discussion about the ability to use AI to translate content that's existing in English or Spanish into other languages, that it can be kind of repurposed to, help podcast adoption?
There was, and just also to put in some context, some of the AI focused presentations I wasn't able to get into because the rooms were already full. So that's how the market is looking at it right now. But there absolutely is, but I do think it's important to, put the appropriate caveats in place. There is a lot of nuance, not just in language, but in culture. And it's not as simple as just, taking a story or a narrative and translating into another language. Like, it may just not fit. One of the producers gave an example of a show that was story-based, and it had this sort of dramatic high point that sort of hinged around somebody getting a false accusation in court and being like falsely imprisoned or something like that. And they were working with a team in Mexico, and the Mexican team said, that is not an emotional high point. Like, that's not going to work in Mexico. Like, if you're trying to build the story around that moment, like, that's not going to work here. And you wouldn't know that unless you had a boots on the ground producer. And that's not the type of thing that an AI can help you with. So it can definitely help with, translating content, and some types of content are probably more conducive to being translated than other types. For example, simple reporting is perhaps more conducive than the example that I just gave. But even then, I think that, there's still going to be that human layer that's required to sort of make sure that everything is, tightened up and appropriate. So it's not a sort of free for all, but I definitely think that the tools are still going to help, producers an awful lot to save time. And I would imagine over the next couple of years, we will see much more content flooding into those markets for this reason.
Neal, you mentioned lower adoption rates based on content availability and number of shows, but I know you dove pretty deep into the work data that was released last week. What other factors are playing into this?
Well, I think a big factor is awareness. Awareness about different types of podcast advertising, for sure, as being a big barrier. Even though, a fair amount of companies around the world have tried podcast or streaming as part of their marketing mix, there's still a long ways to go. The WARC study was conducted. It was in partnership with Spotify, so there's that element to it. But they really summarized that digital audio has lower adoption, lower awareness among marketers. I think the thing that was eye-opening to me, and I'm curious to hear what Kyle thinks about this, is almost 25% of the respondents in the study remain unaware of live read ads. I think that it was 50% were aware of just your standard pre, post, mid-roll ads. So those are eye-opening statistics that there's just not a lot of knowledge around the different forms of advertising. Actually, one of the findings was the awareness of display ads and video ads around digital audio content were actually higher than kind of what we live and breathe, which are the podcast ads and more audio advertising within the audio channels.
I think there's a number of different factors that also play into this, and it's basically also around prosperity and socioeconomic access to hardware to be able to listen to certain media, right? If you take some of the examples of where there's early adoption, like the countries that the clients that we talk to want to get into, ironically, are the ones that are very high have very high net worth individuals, but perhaps low adoption because they're complex media markets like the UK and Germany, France, even Spain and Italy. There are lower adoption versus other countries like India, Indonesia. But the reality is the individuals in these marketplaces have less access to the typology of media that individuals in those other more prosperous and more affluent countries have. The larger the population, the larger the land mass means you have a dispersed population, right? They don't have access to the same kind of media, but they have a mobile phone, so they can listen. The highest propensity of mobile concentration is in India, and in markets like that. So it's also a natural function of how people live and breathe the consumption of the media. So there's going to be, I don't see any change in clients saying, we want to spend, we want to get into the UK, we want to get into Germany, because that's where the highest amount of advertising potential returns are, even if it is sub 30% in terms of adoption. And then you go to India and it's 54%, but they're not necessarily going to spend the same money. So there's also socioeconomic factors and access to technology that can dictate where clients are going to be thinking about spending their dollars.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, a little bit, some further information, I take this with a grain of salt, is that time spent with digital audio is around 20%, and that's pretty consistent in a lot of countries. But the ad spend in digital audio is around 1%. And 1% for the US and lower for other countries. And I know that there's always kind of like that. Time spent doesn't actually equal the investment in advertising channels, because you're advertising against objectives, and you're choosing the channels that you think are going to best serve those objectives.
Sure.
But there is that big disparity, and even like it was just like 30% of the marketers had used podcasts, 25% or so had used digital audio. So there's still so much room for growth.
Sure.
Yeah, and I was wondering about that stat about the 25%. Even realizing there's such a thing as live reads. Is that just about the nomenclature? Like, obviously they're aware that these are happening. Is it a matter of like, they don't know that we call these things live reads, or like when we're experiencing podcasts, like, is that actually a thing? Like, maybe that's just something that we say in the States, oh, we got a live read, we got this, we got that. And I don't know, like I read that stat and it just seems unfathomable to me, but I don't know. Maybe we still got a lot of work to do. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe it's just the terminology more than the actual knowledge of. I hope more people, 25% of marketers, or fewer than 25% of marketers are unaware of live reads, and maybe it's more of like the host endorsement, and maybe it's the question, how the question was asked. I just thought, for you, who's lived and breathed this for as long as you have, I was wondering if it makes you sad to hear that stat.
No, it does. And that's why I'm trying to figure out, like, is there something else to it? Like, live reads are aired for me. And for only, 3/4 of population anywhere, to say, like, I don't even know that that's a thing that I can buy is crazy. I don't know. It's interesting. I want to dig in.
Yeah, are we living in a bubble? Our own?
No, we probably are. We probably are.
Speaking frankly, I didn't know what a live read was until I started working with Oxford Road. So to Kyle's point, they may just not know that That's is a difference. You know what the difference is sort of with the correct industry term for it.
Because we talk about live reads like it's every day,
time.
Right? Yeah. And
we also have a CEO who loves live reads. and is running a campaign on saving the live reads. So
we're
closer to it than most, for sure.
Yeah.
Neal, you referenced certain hotspots of adoption. Do we have any additional data on where those hotspots are, what adoption levels are coming with them, et cetera?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So there's a couple of sources that we use. One is YouGov, and we actually commissioned, we actually purchased YouGov data because we have clients that have international expansion desires. So we were able to buy data on audio usage in other countries for specific audiences. And there's certainly, through their global profile study, there are markets that are well above average in adoption. Some of those are in Asia Pacific region, like Indonesia, Thailand, India. Steve talked about that. Interestingly enough, Japan, which kind of commonly think of as kind of being on the forefront, is really far below average at 11% adoption.
Very insular. Japan as a market across all technologies and media tends to be very far behind. You know, they're still the biggest collectible marketplace of actual physical music in terms of vinyl and CDs. There's still lots and lots of tower records in Japan. Just saying.
Yeah, that's great perspective. And I know that I've read other perspectives in terms of how they actually use podcasts is much different than in how we consume podcasts here. In Europe, Spain and Sweden are above average. UK, Germany are slightly below average, but I know the time spent in those markets has jumped up quite a bit. And then in Latin America, Mexico, Brazil are far above average. In Middle East, Africa, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt are all above average. And I think, some of that has to do with adoption of English language, Spanish for Mexico. I know Brazil is Portuguese market. And then the other thing that is important to know is the YouGov study is based on internet adoption. So in some of those markets, internet adoption is basically full penetration. So UK, Germany, for instance, where in other markets like South Africa, Mexico, and Brazil, it isn't quite there. But for our audiences, and we're typically going after a business audience in some of those markets, the adoption will be much higher for those audiences.
And I know Stephen had mentioned earlier, had referenced some of the barriers from a technological standpoint. Giles, what other barriers are you seeing in adoption internationally?
I think that we've talked about, English and Spanish language being the primary drivers. I think, content availability is the primary one. I think one of the other things that came up in the conference was just the different availability of software, which I know seems like a strange thing, perhaps, but we just assume that content is pushed out and people have Spotify or Apple Podcasts on their phones. But in fact, in India, and I can't remember which one it was, somebody was talking about this. I think it was Apple Podcast app, maybe Spotify, maybe both. Like they don't exist, or at least there is a local player which really dominates the market. But if the content isn't pushed out to the local players, then it just isn't made available. So I know it comes back to content, but there are some of those, actual sort of technological restrictions as well, which are limiting consumption in certain countries.
I think there's also been a lot of people jumped on the bandwagon early on, and a lot of companies signed up to take on podcast on their networks and paid out expensive MGs to have access to be able to sell those shows, and then the impressions just didn't deliver, and a lot of them have fallen by the wayside. And that is a challenge, and it's an arc at the beginning of a business. I do think it's going to recoup. I think as AI does develop and transcreation becomes easier to be able to implant, global ads into locally oriented sort of content, that's going to develop. I only see that quickening in the next 18 months. technology, there's a high level of technology adoption in a lot of those poorer markets, but the media just isn't out there yet. So they've got, just can't listen to it.
I was just thinking, like, as you bring that up, Steve, like, I know that you worked in movie distribution in different markets. And is it a content? Were there movies that just were blockbusters in some markets and just fell flat for whatever reason? Like, I think it could be a content issue, right? Like, Serial's not going to play everywhere because people don't care about these stories sometimes.
I mean, genres play everywhere, but it needs to be, it's the classic adage that anyone sort of says, think global, act local, right? So you're going to have a globally launched piece of content, but it's got to appeal at a local level, which is why I talk about the nuances and idiosyncrasies. It's interesting you talk about the film aspect of it. I do remember in my past life where we would market some movies. There are some movies that you would be able to market as a horror movie, and yet in certain markets it would be considered a romance. And I say this laughing, but The Wolfman, for example, we when I was at Universal, we marketed that in Europe as kind of like a classic horror movie, and yet in the Far East it had to be done as a romance because it didn't even touch the sides of what they consider a horror movie. So there are nuances with regards to how content is perceived, but comedy is comedy as long as it's a locally oriented sort of topical sort of piece of comedy. News is always going to be that right way. Technology, I think genres, but spoken in a local tongue and with through a local lens is what's going to be important. There's always going to be those few shows that transcend that, but
of course.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess to Giles' point earlier about not just being able to translate using AI, it's like movies have subtitles, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a smash hit just because somebody in Japan can listen to an English movie. I guess, Stephen, based on your comment earlier about networks shelling out tons of money, do we have any exposure into sort of the licensing and usage deals that some podcast hosts are negotiating in order to have their shows played internationally, say in that new provider that's huge in India?
I mean, I don't have a standard response to that question, but I must, it's going to depend on the host. The reality is, there are certain important hosts in this market that just won't have an appeal internationally. But yet there are some subject matter, specifically with regards to sport, that it's not necessarily the host, it's the content. There are global fans of the Los Angeles Lakers in every single market. So a podcast that's tailored for that is going to appeal to international markets. If you notice, I deftly avoided talking about soccer.
I know. I was going to prompt you directly, but then I got nervous.
I was going to
that way we would have a media round table that would go on until Christmas. So we don't want to do that.
Go figure though that Joe Rogan is really popular in the UK.
Okay, yeah, I get that.
It surprised me.
Surprisingly is, yeah. But that's just because of controversy, right? And he also speaks to a lot of international folk. So it's also who they host. He has access to some of the world's greatest talent, whether they're in the US or not. So he's going to appeal. But I would say, Piers Morgan, he has appeal because he's lived in both markets. Yeah, I'm not sure if Adam Buxton's ever going to cut it here, although I love his podcast in the UK. So that he's a local sort of nuance.
Well, and speaking about Joe Rogan, I guess, Giles, what type of brand safety conversations were happening while you were at Podcast Show London? I mean, I know this is a very, very nuanced topic. Things that are very socially acceptable in some countries are less socially acceptable in others. Like how is the UK market navigating these types of issues, or even discussing how they may navigate them?
I think that they are still early in that journey. I think that they're just sort of starting to realize that this is a non-negotiable, and they need to start to have solutions, particularly for as larger brands enter the market in the UK, as they have done in the US over the past few years, and as US brands come into the UK market. The solutions need to be there. I think that some of the that there are a couple of brands in the space, as we know, that have sort of started to get good traction in the US. And I think that there are conversations happening for sure. But even, the US and the UK, two countries divided by a common language, like the dialect simply isn't the same. I mean, I know it might seem, strange, but the slang, like there's nuance, there's detail, there's, different vocabulary really. And so brand safety products that have been built in the US and trained on US data are not necessarily going to provide the right solution. So I think it's on the supplier side and on the publisher side, like they're both sort of moving forward as quickly as they can in terms of the conversations that they need to have and the implementations that they need to build. But yes, I would say still probably 6 months behind the US, if not more.
Well, and Kyle and Stephen, I'd love to hear your thoughts sort of to Giles' point on import and export content. What are we learning about content that we're importing into the US, and content that we're importing to the US, and how ad spend has to happen around this and export as well?
Importing content. I mean, I don't know. I think it's more about like brands are global. Well, let's just use this as an example. How many real global events are there that garner absolute global audiences? I would argue you can only really count them under 10. Super Bowl, right? Olympics, World Cup, the Oscars, maybe the Golden Globes. You start to teeter off, right? So those big live events happen, but people really gravitate to their own what they know locally. So brands are international, but for them to be successful international, you need to tailor what they're doing to the content at a local level, is my perspective. Because, Coca-Cola, how many shows? I mean, they'll buy ads in the Super Bowl and they'll reach a global audience, but that's a one-time hit. And it's expensive. Okay, it's actually not that expensive when you boil it down to a CPM perspective, but it's a large ticket entry price. But then that's just the one big hit. They're doing performance media or they want to have a constant brand presence. They've got to go in those shows that are small multiples, small reach, but you add them all together and it's potent reach. And it's the same within podcast. So I think we need to really be thinking about doing an overlay of big popular shows, but augmented by the local appeal. That would be my perspective. I think I've answered that question, or maybe gone off.
Yeah, no, that was exactly what I was hoping for.
I would say, I'm sorry. I would add, when we first started going internationally, like the easy thing, the lowest bar or the lowest hanging fruit was like, let's take the best performing shows we have here and just turn on impressions elsewhere. That works sometimes, but to, I think, our conversation earlier, it doesn't always pan out. Like what resonates here in the stateside doesn't necessarily work in Canada or UK or Germany or wherever we end up going. However, we have seen success in some of the other areas, like streaming content, for example, where it is local content and we're just purchasing from an international resource. We're seeing success in that space.
And so how are we approaching things like geolocation and trackability with some of these international shows?
Over to you, Carl.
No, I mean, that has been, even articulating what it means to track has been a challenge. We've worked in some markets where they said, we'll give full visibility into the tracking of the campaign, which from our perspective is, I'm going to see impressions, I'm going to see sessions, I'm going to see conversions, what have you. I'll have full visibility into the performance of this campaign. All that to find out that in this market, for whatever reason, performance or sharing performance is impressions. Like, we delivered in full your impressions. And we're like, that's great. How did it work? We have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's still early days from that perspective, from attribution. I know that some of the suppliers are desperately trying to ramp up, but
it's a challenge. And like, just even what we understand as being like showing performance is different. And again, like the privacy the privacy laws in place overseas is
GDPR
much different than what we're dealing with. And so we're working with a number of different partners to try to figure out like how to cross the T's, dot the I's. And we have a way now that we actually can track performance in the way that we look at it across the seas. And it's not for every single vendor. It's not for every single podcast or streaming partner, but we do have a way that we've discovered that's given us pretty accurate results.
And I would say that whilst we might not be the largest player out there, I would say that we have been actively and to a degree aggressively building out our international capabilities. What we've learned in the last 24 months and what we sometimes very hard lessons, I think it's fair to say right now.
That's why my beard's now gray is because of these hard lessons. Yeah.
And obviously I had a full head of hair when we started doing it. Now I was just copying Neal, but the bottom line is I think the learnings that we've managed to accrue in the last 2 years have set us up very well. Yes, we've got presence in those markets. There's also a whole lot you can do from the homegrown market into international. I think the beauty of digital audio is very much that. But, you know, really digging in, understanding what drives and motivates those audiences with regards to audio consumption is something that we've definitely forged forward, and we've seen a lot of fruit with a number of different large, you know, category brands that we're working with. So the more we can accrue, the better it'll be.
I think we've also learned a ton in the past 12 to 24 months about brand safety and finding the right sources to ensure brand safety as we expand into international markets.
Oh yeah, the international brand safety internationally is quite an adventure. Just diving into that and what it means in each market and what it means for each client. That's something that we're continuously trying to sharpen because it changes. And even within individual clients, like we'll go back in 6 months and say, 6 months ago, you said this about your brand safety. What do you think now? Oh, we've completely changed that because of X, Y, and Z. Okay. So staying on top of that and managing their expectations, how they apply, you know, here stateside and then internationally is a full-time job. It's wonderful.
Well, and I think it's easy for us to assume that because America is the largest player in this industry, because they are the most advanced, that we surely have the best tools available. But looking internationally, having been in this space for several years now, have we found anything developed in a country outside of the US that is superior to tools we have homegrown, or is measuring something different that we hadn't necessarily thought to measure before, or is the US still a clear winner across the board?
I think it comes down to the adoption of the media types that we're talking about. And so it's not that the US is better, it's just we've been at this a little bit longer, I think, on some of the fronts. And so we've identified the issues earlier, and now it's being played out on an international field. So I don't think it's necessarily anybody's behind. It's just we've had Serial for now 10 years. And so now what do we do with it?
Yeah. And I think, you know, the interesting thing is as more and more adoption takes place, we are, however, going to have to work much more in the area of transcreation, which we've already built out to a degree. We have examples of advertisers based here in the US who are coming to us for services in international, and we're saying, yeah, but just because Giles and I speak with a British accent doesn't mean to say that we should be actually dubbing your ads for you. You need to get somebody who's actually boots on the ground, who knows the local nuance. I mean, you know, Giles is based in London. He's part of our crew there, so that does help. But, you know, understanding what's going on at a local level to be able to tease out those idiosyncrasies of what's right and what's going to appeal to the audience is so critical. And that's in French, German, Italian, Spanish, the list goes on. It's got to be. You can't just have somebody who happens to speak the language. No, they need to be living it. They need to be living there and be able to tease out, especially with live reads, but also obviously that's going to be the case with the hosts. But if we're going to be dynamically inserting, we've got to make it tailored to that local market.
Politically, culturally, etc.
Yeah, even just in terms of slang, vernacular, being able to speak the local term, because it is such a personal medium. You've got to be so personal about it, because audiences will switch off if they just hear a whitewashed ad.
Years ago, I did a Spanish campaign in the United States nationally, and what we found was like California Spanish speakers use different words than Florida Spanish speakers, and those Spanish speakers in New York, they use different terms for different things.
The dialect between somebody from Guatemala, Cuba, El Salvador, everything is very different.
Yeah. So just the fact that they live in the same country and speak the same language doesn't mean that you can you're off the hook. You just do a quick translation.
You got to get it right.
You need boots on the ground 100%, because
we could not take a Spanish speaker from California and expect it to work in Catalan. It just wouldn't work.
We tried that. It failed miserably.
Thank you for that. Which other failures can we talk about on the Media Roundtable this week?
Lesson learned.
Listen, you learn from your failures.
Yeah, we learned a lesson.
Learned so much.
We learned a ton in the last 2.5 years.
Well, obviously there is so much more that we can discuss. This is the first episode that we have where we've had an international focus, of many more to come. Stephen, Giles, thank you for adding the credibility in ways that Kyle and Neal and I could not.
It's the accent. It's the accents.
Actually, I'm actually from Austin, Texas, but
it works. It works. Can Stephen do his American accent to sign us off?
No, that brand safety issue.
Which one do you want? I mean,
I thought you were going to ask us to show off all our international language skills, because they are not bad. Maybe next time.
They're wonderful.
Well,
we should have started with all that.
Before this becomes a show that no sponsors can support, I'm going to go ahead and cut it short. As always, this show is dedicated to our mission of mobilizing marketers to advance truth and civility in journalism. We want you to not just know the news, but to use it for good. If you're a marketer looking to balance business objectives with your brand values, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to The Influencer. Thank you to our guests, James Cridland, and to those from our team. Also to Bianca, Haley, and the team at Podcast One. As always, influence responsibly.
And you can contact us wherever you are, whichever part.
Wherever you are.